Welcome back to Afri Tales. Continue to next part. And as time unfolded like a river that never stopped flowing, the story of Anne and Marcus became something larger than bloodlines and biographies. It became a living philosophy, woven into the everyday choices of men and women who had never met them but had heard their names whispered like a blessing, for in the schools their foundation built. Young girls spoke of and as though she were still alive, guiding their pens as they traced their first letters, and in government offices where integrity was rare, some leaders reminded themselves of Marcus's courage to rebuild a business not with greed but with honesty, and so their influence trickled into places far beyond their reach, reshaping not only families but societies, until even in bustling Nigerian cities, billboards and murals began to appear with their faces painted beside words like resilience, courage, faith, and loyalty, symbols to remind the modern generation that love is not weakness but strength, not naivety but wisdom. Their grandchildren, now grown, carried this torch boldly, some stepping into politics to fight corruption with clean hands, others leading schools that redefined education with compassion rather than competition, and some venturing into business determined to prove that success need not come at the expense of conscience. And every time they succeeded, they whispered silently, "This is for and this is for Marcus." Lydia, aging gracefully, often sat on her veranda watching the sun set over the same sky her parents once looked upon, and as her children and grandchildren gathered around her, she retold their love story not with rehearsed speeches but with raw details, the nights of tears, the mornings of hope, the fierce loyalty that withstood storms, and she always ended with the same words. Their love was not perfect, but it was powerful enough to change everything. These retellings became a ritual, a way to ensure that the next generation did not merely inherit land or wealth but inherited the wisdom of a story that had shaped their destiny. Soon, universities began teaching case studies about Anne and Marcus, not in history classes but in courses about leadership, ethics, and social transformation, and their story was dramatized in films, retold on television, adapted into plays in village squares, reaching millions who drew strength from it. In villages where once despair had been normal, young girls now stood taller, saying, "If and could overcome rejection, so can I." And in cities where corruption tempted many, young men said, "If Marcus could rebuild with integrity, so can I." Even faith communities embraced their legacy, quoting their journey as evidence that divine strength carries human weakness into victory. Decades passed, yet the torch of their story burned brighter, until one day a monument was erected in their honor in the heart of Lagos, not simply to immortalize their faces in stone but to remind future generations that love, resilience, and faith are not outdated virtues but the very foundation of progress. And as crowds gathered on the day of its unveiling, Lydia stood before them with trembling hands and a voice both strong and tender, declaring, "My parents were not extraordinary because they were flawless, they were extraordinary because they were faithful. Faithful to each other, faithful to their calling, faithful to hope." And as the people applauded, she felt the presence of Anne and Marcus like a warm wind against her face, reminding her that their story was not finished, for every person touched by it would carry it forward in their own way, and thus the tale of Anne and Marcus continued, not bound by pages or graves, but alive in every act of courage, in every choice of integrity, in every whisper of love spoken in the face of rejection, proof eternal that even when the night is darkest, dawn will always come. And after the monument was unveiled, it became more than stone and steel. It became a pilgrimage site where young lovers, broken widows, rejected daughters, and struggling sons came to draw strength, kneeling at its base not to worship idols but to remind themselves that if two ordinary people could carve eternity out of pain, so could they, and soon. Scholars from across Africa and even beyond came to Nigeria to study not only the couple's life but the ripple effect of their choices, writing books, producing documentaries, and telling their story in conferences from Accra to Nairobi, from London to New York, until their names became known on lips far removed from their soil, a reminder that love and resilience are languages understood everywhere. In time, their great-grandchildren traveled to represent their family at international gatherings, speaking proudly of their roots and of how a woman once rejected by society gave birth to a lineage of strength. And as they spoke, audiences rose to their feet not just for the eloquence of their words but for the authenticity of their story. Lydia, now frail yet still glowing with the fire of her parents, lived long enough to witness this global recognition, and on quiet evenings when her children and grandchildren sat at her feet, she would smile and say, "The world may honor them now, but their greatest victory was never applause. It was that they never let go of each other, even when the world let go of them," and tears would glisten in the eyes of her listeners, because they knew those words carried the weight of truth. Schools named libraries after Anne, hospitals bore Marcus's name, and scholarships were offered in their memory to children who might otherwise never have dreamed of education, and every life touched added another thread to the vast tapestry of their legacy. Even in politics, when leaders debated issues of justice and fairness, some would invoke the Anne and Marcus principle, a phrase that came to mean choosing integrity over convenience, love over prejudice, and courage over fear, and though generations turned, their influence only deepened, until a century after Anne first walked down that aisle trembling yet hopeful, her story was still told as though it had happened yesterday, and young brides, nervous and uncertain, whispered her name under their breath as a prayer of courage, while young grooms studied Marcus's example to learn how to stand unshaken for the one they loved. Their story, born of tears and trials, had become a compass for millions, and as the sun set and rose across years, Anne and Marcus lived on, not in flesh and bone, but in faith and fire, proving that though time erases faces, it can never erase the legacy of love that dared to endure. The Anne and Marcus principle, not just in ethics classes but in leadership programs for future presidents, CEOs, and thinkers, and every generation rediscovered them anew, seeing in their trials a reflection of their own struggles, finding in their victory the courage to rise. By the time humanity had reached beyond Earth, colonizing the stars, their story traveled too, inscribed on digital archives carried to space stations and even carved onto monuments on distant planets. For wherever humans went, they carried with them their greatest lessons, and among them, Anne and Marcus stood as proof that love and faith were as essential as food and water. Families on new worlds told their story around artificial fires just as elders once did under moonlit skies in Nigeria, and young children born light years away still whispered their names with awe, not because they were gods but because they were human enough to endure and therefore divine enough to inspire. In this way, Anne and Marcus became more than a couple, more than ancestors, more than history. They became a pulse beating through centuries, a dawn that kept rising no matter how many nights fell, proof eternal that rejection cannot kill resilience, that love is stronger than fear, and that destiny belongs to those who dare to walk forward, even when the world tells them to turn back. And as millennia passed and the world itself reshaped, empires rose and fell, languages evolved, continents shifted, and even the stars above seemed different to the eyes of future generations. Still the story of Anne and Marcus endured, not in brittle books that could decay nor in monuments that could crumble, but in the living memory of humanity's collective soul, for what had begun as the trembling steps of a bride walking down an aisle in Nigeria had, across thousands of years, become a parable retold in every tongue, every tradition, every belief system, until their names no longer belonged only to their bloodline or even to their nation, but to the entire human race. In villages that had transformed into towering megacities, children still gathered around their elders, though now the elders used holographic firelight instead of wood flames, to hear how Anne faced rejection yet refused to surrender, and how Marcus built not with greed but with faith, and though the details shifted with time, the heartbeat of their story always returned. Love can endure, faith can carry. Resilience can transform night into dawn. Across future worlds, colonies carved on other planets, their story traveled like a seed that refused to die. In domes on Mars, brides whispered Anne's name before stepping into marriages of courage, while in orbital cities circling Saturn, leaders cited Marcus's principle when tempted with corruption, remembering that a foundation without integrity is no foundation at all. Scholars debated whether Anne and Marcus were historical or mythological, but the truth no longer mattered, for to humanity they had become archetypes, symbols of what it meant to remain human in the face of despair, and in temples of every faith, their story was quoted as though sacred scripture, because it was not religion that carried them forward but the raw, unbreakable truth of love lived with courage. Time turned their lives into legend, legend into myth, myth into guiding light, so that even 1,000 years later, when humanity stretched its roots among the stars, when nations as we knew them dissolved into federations across galaxies, still at the core of civilization, their story burned like an eternal torch, reminding every age that progress without love is hollow, wealth without integrity is empty, and destiny without faith is impossible. In this way, Anne and Marcus became not simply remembered but eternal, their names carried on the breath of every generation, proof that two souls who dared to choose love over fear could become the compass for all humanity, forever guiding it toward dawn, no matter how dark the night became. And when even the memory of nations blurred into dust, when Earth itself became only one cradle among countless homes humanity had built across galaxies, still Anne and Marcus lived on, not in fragile statues or fading archives, but in the way people defined love, loyalty, and courage, for their names had become less about two individuals and more about a universal language, a shorthand for resilience, so that in starfaring civilizations where humans had merged with machines and time was measured in millennia, couples who faced hardships still said to one another, "Remember Anne and Marcus." And with those words came strength to endure. In vast academies orbiting suns, their tale was studied not as history but as a moral constant, as essential as gravity, as timeless as light, and philosophers wrote that Anne and Marcus represented the eternal struggle of the human soul, the rejection that all must face, the courage that all must choose, the dawn that all must believe in. Across alien worlds where humanity mingled with other species, the story was shared as proof that though cultures differ, the pulse of love and integrity is the same everywhere, and in time, Anne and Marcus became not just symbols of Nigeria, or Earth, but of humanity itself, the story by which the species defined its own heart. Some worshipped them as saints, some honored them as ancestors, some saw them as archetypes in an endless cycle, but all agreed that without them the language of hope would be poorer, the vision of faith dimmer. Thousands of years later, when historians tried to trace their lives back to facts, they found fragments, old texts, recordings, monuments, and though they debated the accuracy, it no longer mattered, because the truth of their impact was self-evident in the way humanity lived. Every vow spoken in marriage echoed Anne's courage, every oath of leadership echoed Marcus's integrity, and every whispered hope in the darkest night echoed their shared resilience. Thus, though their bodies had long returned to dust, Anne and Marcus became eternal, not because they escaped death, but because their story had fused with the very definition of what it meant to be human, a torch carried from age to age, from world to world, from star to star, proving forever that love is stronger than fear, faith deeper than despair, and destiny always belongs to those who dare to walk forward, even when the universe itself seems to tell them to turn back. And when humanity no longer looked like the humanity Anne and Marcus once knew, when bodies were reshaped by science, when minds stretched beyond flesh into networks of light, when even Earth itself was but a memory whispered in cosmic corridors, still their story lived, woven into the marrow of identity itself, for though faces and forms had changed, the soul had not, and the soul remembered. The tale of a woman who walked down an aisle with trembling steps and a man who lifted her veil with steady hands had become a timeless parable, the primal heartbeat of every vow spoken, every promise kept, every dawn awaited after a night of despair. In this far-flung future, beings who no longer needed air or soil still carried Anne's courage as a seed within them, and Marcus's integrity as a compass by which to steer, and across galaxies where civilizations rose and fell like tides, their names were spoken as if they were the very breath of hope, and Marcus, dawn. Some no longer saw them as individuals but as eternal archetypes, and as the embodiment of resilience, Marcus as the essence of loyalty, their love the bridge that made existence bearable. When humanity met other intelligent life, it was their story, not weapons or technology, that explained who we truly were, for no tale better expressed the fragile strength of our kind. And when scholars of alien worlds asked, "What does it mean to be human?" our descendants did not answer with science or history but with a story. The story of Anne and Marcus, who proved that love could endure rejection, that faith could outlast fear, that destiny could be chosen even against the odds. Thus their story outlived time, culture, and even species, carried like a torch through eternity, reminding every being who heard it that though the universe is vast and dark, dawn still comes, and love is still the only power great enough to turn despair into destiny. And when even galaxies aged and folded into silence, when stars that once burned as bright as hope collapsed into quiet shadows, when the universe itself began to draw inward as though preparing for its own great rest. Still the story of Anne and Marcus moved like an echo that could not be silenced, because by then it was no longer bound to books or monuments or even the fragile memory of species. It had become woven into the fabric of existence itself, a rhythm as constant as gravity, a law as unshakable as light. In every dawn that broke across every world, there was Anne's courage. In every oath spoken with truth, there was Marcus's loyalty. In every heart that chose love instead of fear, their footsteps could be heard as though they still walked beside us. Philosophers of dying civilizations whispered that Anne and Marcus were not just humans who lived, but archetypes born from the universe itself to teach its greatest lesson. That meaning is not found in avoiding suffering but in enduring it with love. And when the last children of humanity gazed up at fading stars, preparing for journeys into realms unknown, they too told the story one more time, as if offering it back to the cosmos that had given them life, and the cosmos, in its silent majesty, seemed to hold the memory, keeping it safe. For even if suns vanish and worlds crumble, love remains, and the universe itself remembers those who dared to walk forward into rejection and darkness, and in doing so, became light. Thus Anne and Marcus, who began as two fragile souls on a small corner of earth, became eternal not by escaping mortality but by proving that love, faith, and resilience are the only truths that outlast everything, even time itself. And when the universe itself exhaled its final breath, collapsing into silence deeper than any night, it might have seemed that all stories, even the most enduring, would fade into nothing. But love is not so easily erased, and in the quiet beyond the stars, where no sound could travel and no light could shine, the memory of Anne and Marcus still pulsed, like a heartbeat waiting for dawn. And then, as mysteries beyond comprehension unfolded, as the old cosmos folded itself into a seed, preparing for a new beginning, it was their story, woven into the very vibration of existence, that was carried across that threshold, so that when the new universe bloomed, expanding with fresh stars and newborn worlds, its first whispers of truth were not equations of physics nor patterns of matter, but the story of love that had endured, a parable rising like a hymn in the silence, that when rejection comes, resilience can answer, when fear threatens, faith can stand, when the night is darkest, dawn can still come. And so in this new creation, where new beings would one day awaken to wonder and ask what life meant, they would inherit not only the laws of light and gravity but the law of Anne and Marcus, a law not written in stone but inscribed in the very heartbeat of existence, that destiny belongs to those who dare to walk forward, even when the universe itself whispers to turn back. In this way, Anne and Marcus became eternal not only in memory or myth but in the architecture of creation itself, the spark that lit the first dawn of the next world, proof that love is the only story the universe will always tell, again and again, forever. And when the new universe stretched open its newborn skies, stars igniting like the eyes of a child seeing for the first time, and worlds took shape with mountains, rivers, and oceans that had never known a name, the memory of and Marcus awakened there too, not as history, for no trace of earth remained, but as a myth woven into the very rhythm of being, a story that whispered itself into the minds of the first dreamers of that creation. In one world of blue forests and silver seas, elders told their children of a woman who walked into darkness unafraid and a man who stood beside her when all else fell away. On another world, where beings of light wove songs instead of words, their hymns always carried a refrain of dawn rising after despair, the echo of Anne and Marcus hidden in melodies they could not explain but could never forget. And as civilizations blossomed, cultures of stone, of fire, of flight, of thought, they each, in their own way, rediscovered the principle that had once guided two fragile humans on a small planet long gone, that love, loyalty, and courage are not inventions of a single people but the pulse of creation itself. Some saw Anne and Marcus as deities, others as archetypes, others still as nameless symbols of the eternal bond, but all felt their presence as a compass pointing toward truth. And when these new beings looked up at their alien skies, wondering if they were alone, the whisper always came, not in human words, not in voices, but in the deep place of the soul that recognizes dawn before it breaks. Walk forward, even when the night is darkest, for light will come. Thus Anne and Marcus, who once lived and died as ordinary humans, became extraordinary across worlds they would never see, their story not ending with one universe but reborn with every universe that dawns. As the decades stretched into centuries, and Marcus's story refused to fade, instead it grew brighter, carried not just in memory but in the living choices of those who claimed them as ancestors or even those who simply claimed them as inspiration, for their great-grandchildren and the generations that followed did not live in the shadows of their legacy but in the light of it, using their names as a compass in a world that was always changing. And one of their great-grandsons, Adewale, rose to become a respected statesman in Nigeria, a leader who refused to bow to corruption even when it cost him popularity, often quoting his great-grandfather Marcus in parliamentary debates, saying, "Integrity is the only foundation worth building upon." And when international observers visited the Nigerian assembly, they were struck not only by his words but by the conviction in his eyes, as if Marcus himself were still standing there through his bloodline, reminding the nation of the courage it once birthed. At the same time, another great-grandchild, Kayamaka, became a renowned educator, building schools across rural Nigeria where children once abandoned to poverty now learned under roofs that carried his name, and she often told the story of how her great-grandmother had once walked down an aisle unsure of her future but dared to walk anyway, turning fear into destiny, and as her students listened, they felt that if and could overcome, so could they. And beyond Africa, the story traveled further still. Universities in America and Europe invited the descendants of Anne and Marcus to speak on ethics, love, and resilience, and conferences broadcast their words to millions, making Anne and Marcus not just Nigerian heroes but global icons of human endurance. In villages, elders still told their story under moonlight, sitting with children who listened wide-eyed as though hearing a fairy tale, except this was no fiction. It was flesh and blood turned legend, a parable lived out in human form. And when the elders reached the part where and walked down the aisle trembling, where Marcus lifted her veil and whispered, "You're my forever," children's hearts swelled with hope, some whispering silently that one day they too would find someone who saw them not for what the world rejected but for who they truly were. Their story wove into music as well, with folk singers in Nigeria composing ballads of Anne and Marcus, songs sung at weddings and festivals, reminding every couple that love was not just about celebration but about resilience, about facing rejection with courage. As technology advanced and digital platforms spread, their story became a viral narrative, retold in short films, animations, and even virtual reality experiences where people could step into their shoes and feel the journey from despair to hope, from rejection to acceptance, and young people around the world connected with it as though Anne and Marcus belonged to them too. In churches, pastors preached their story as a sermon of perseverance, while in mosques, imams quoted their resilience as an example of faith, proving that their legacy was not confined by religion but embraced by humanity. Their descendants, scattered across continents, carried the story like a torch, some entering medicine to heal, some entering law to fight for justice, some entering business determined to trade fairly in honor of Marcus, and some becoming poets and artists who painted Anne's image with colors of dawn breaking through darkness. And yet, even as their fame spread, their story remained rooted in Nigeria, for in the villages where they had once been rejected, their names were now honored, and in the cities where they had once struggled, their story was etched on monuments, murals, and even currency notes, because a nation that once overlooked them now claimed them as proof of its resilience. 200 years later, Anne and Marcus's names were no longer just remembered. They had entered folklore, their story told alongside ancient proverbs, shaping cultural identity, and every Nigerian child knew the phrase, "When the night is darkest, dawn will still come," a line attributed to Anne and Marcus, engraved on school walls, whispered by parents, and inscribed in history books. At global gatherings like the United Nations, speakers referenced the Anne and Marcus principle as a model of ethical leadership, a reminder that the decisions of one couple could ripple across generations to influence nations, and even in times of world crisis, their story was invoked to encourage leaders not to give up. Their legacy had transcended their time, becoming timeless, becoming a torch that illuminated paths they never walked, touching lives they never saw, proving that love, when rooted in resilience and faith, could truly outlive death, rejection, and even the erosion of centuries, becoming not just history but destiny written in the soul of humanity. And so, as centuries turned and calendars marked time that neither Anne nor Marcus had ever dreamed of seeing, their story continued to walk among the living, not with flesh and blood but with the power of remembrance. For even 500 years after that trembling walk down the aisle, their names had not faded into dust. Rather, they had grown into symbols woven into the very DNA of Nigeria's cultural identity, and by then their tale had become less a biography and more a legend retold in countless forms. Sometimes as a folk tale where and was painted as a brave queen who defied the rejection of a kingdom to find her true throne, sometimes as a parable in classrooms where Marcus was portrayed as a wise builder who rebuilt a city not of stone but of trust, and though details shifted with the telling, the heart of the story never changed. Resilience, loyalty, and faith had turned despair into destiny. Technology advanced beyond recognition. Holographic theaters allowed people to step into Anne's wedding day. Virtual archives let students meet Marcus at his desk of financial struggle, and artificial intelligences quoted their words as if they were still alive, mentoring a future they had never seen. And yet across all these innovations, their story was not treated as fiction but as a foundational truth of human courage. In Nigeria, their legacy had grown so deep that national holidays were celebrated in their honor, called the Dawn Festival, marked every year with weddings, renewal of vows, and community service to remind people that love must be lived in action, not only in ceremony. And around bonfires in rural towns, their names were still sung in songs that mixed ancient drums with modern rhythms, making them eternal in music. Globally, universities still taught. As the decades stretched into centuries, and Marcus's story refused to fade, instead it grew brighter, carried not just in memory but in the living choices of those who claimed them as ancestors or even those who simply claimed them as inspiration, for their great-grandchildren and the generations that followed did not live in the shadows of their legacy but in the light of it, using their names as a compass in a world that was always changing. And one of their great-grandsons, Adewale, rose to become a respected statesman in Nigeria, a leader who refused to bow to corruption even when it cost him popularity, often quoting his great-grandfather Marcus in parliamentary debates, saying, "Integrity is the only foundation worth building upon." And when international observers visited the Nigerian assembly, they were struck not only by his words but by the conviction in his eyes, as if Marcus himself were still standing there through his bloodline, reminding the nation of the courage it once birthed. At the same time, another great-grandchild, Kayamaka, became a renowned educator, building schools across rural Nigeria where children once abandoned to poverty now learned under roofs that carried his name, and she often told the story of how her great-grandmother had once walked down an aisle unsure of her future but dared to walk anyway, turning fear into destiny, and as her students listened, they felt that if and could overcome, so could they. And beyond Africa, the story traveled further still. Universities in America and Europe invited the descendants of Anne and Marcus to speak on ethics, love, and resilience, and conferences broadcast their words to millions, making Anne and Marcus not just Nigerian heroes but global icons of human endurance. In villages, elders still told their story under moonlight, sitting with children who listened wide-eyed as though hearing a fairy tale, except this was no fiction. It was flesh and blood turned legend, a parable lived out in human form. And when the elders reached the part where and walked down the aisle trembling, where Marcus lifted her veil and whispered, "You're my forever," children's hearts swelled with hope, some whispering silently that one day they too would find someone who saw them not for what the world rejected but for who they truly were. Their story wove into music as well, with folk singers in Nigeria composing ballads of Anne and Marcus, songs sung at weddings and festivals, reminding every couple that love was not just about celebration but about resilience, about facing rejection with courage. As technology advanced and digital platforms spread, their story became a viral narrative, retold in short films, animations, and even virtual reality experiences where people could step into their shoes and feel the journey from despair to hope, from rejection to acceptance, and young people around the world connected with it as though Anne and Marcus belonged to them too. In churches, pastors preached their story as a sermon of perseverance, while in mosques, imams quoted their resilience as an example of faith, proving that their legacy was not confined by religion but embraced by humanity. Their descendants, scattered across continents, carried the story like a torch, some entering medicine to heal, some entering law to fight for justice, some entering business determined to trade fairly in honor of Marcus, and some becoming poets and artists who painted An's image with colors of dawn breaking through darkness. And yet, even as their fame spread, their story remained rooted in Nigeria, for in the villages where they had once been rejected, their names were now honored, and in the cities where they had once struggled, their story was etched on monuments, murals, and even currency notes, because a nation that once overlooked them now claimed them as proof of its resilience. 200 years later, An and Marcus's names were no longer just remembered. They had entered folklore, their story told alongside ancient proverbs, shaping cultural identity, and every Nigerian child knew the phrase, "When the night is darkest, dawn will still come," a line attributed to An and Marcus, engraved on school walls, whispered by parents, and inscribed in history books. At global gatherings like the United Nations, speakers referenced the An and Marcus principle as a model of ethical leadership, a reminder that the decisions of one couple could ripple across generations to influence nations, and even in times of world crisis, their story was invoked to encourage leaders not to give up. Their legacy had transcended their time, becoming timeless, becoming a torch that illuminated paths they never walked, touching lives they never saw, proving that love, when rooted in resilience and faith, could truly outlive death, rejection, and even the erosion of centuries, becoming not just history but destiny written in the soul of humanity. And so, as centuries turned and calendars marked time that neither An nor Marcus had ever dreamed of seeing, their story continued to walk among the living, not with flesh and blood but with the power of remembrance. For even 500 years after that trembling walk down the aisle, their names had not faded into dust. Rather, they had grown into symbols woven into the very DNA of Nigeria's cultural identity, and by then their tale had become less a biography and more a legend retold in countless forms. Sometimes as a folk tale where An was painted as a brave queen who defied the rejection of a kingdom to find her true throne, sometimes as a parable in classrooms where Marcus was portrayed as a wise builder who rebuilt a city not of stone but of trust, and though details shifted with the telling, the heart of the story never changed. Resilience, loyalty, and faith had turned despair into destiny. Technology advanced beyond recognition. Holographic theaters allowed people to step into An's wedding day. Virtual archives let students meet Marcus at his desk of financial struggle, and artificial intelligences quoted their words as if they were still alive, mentoring a future they had never seen, and yet across all these innovations, their story was not treated as fiction but as a foundational truth of human courage. In Nigeria, their legacy had grown so deep that national holidays were celebrated in their honor, called the Dawn Festival, marked every year with weddings, renewal of vows, and community service to remind people that love must be lived in action, not only in ceremony, and around bonfires in rural towns. Their names were still sung in songs that mixed ancient drums with modern rhythms, making them eternal in music. Globally, universities still taught proof eternal that love is the first language creation ever speaks and the last it ever remembers. And so the wheel of existence turned not once, not twice, but endlessly, universes blooming and folding like flowers in an infinite garden, each with its own stars, its own worlds, its own beings who rose and wondered, who loved and lost, who searched for meaning in the silence of the void, and always, always, the story of An and Marcus was there, carried like a hidden seed through the collapse of one cosmos into the birth of another, whispered in the first winds, etched in the first stones, sung in the first voices of each creation. Sometimes they were remembered as lovers who defied kingdoms, sometimes as builders who raised civilizations, sometimes as nameless wanderers who carried light through darkness. But no matter how the names changed, the heart of the myth remained unchanged. That love is stronger than rejection, that faith endures longer than fear, that destiny belongs not to the powerful but to the faithful. In some universes they were honored as gods, in others as ancestors, in others as patterns written into the stars themselves, and in each, their story guided civilizations through despair into dawn. And across these infinite cycles, the tale of An and Marcus grew into something greater than myth. It became the law of existence, the song every universe sang as it was born, the hymn every being knew without learning, the dawn that every night anticipated. For though forms change and worlds vanish, the truth does not, that even when the night is darkest, dawn will come, and even when rejection surrounds, love will endure. Thus Anne and Marcus, who once trembled as bride and groom in a single fragile moment of time, became the eternal pulse of creation itself, a rhythm beating through every universe, forever proving that stories are not bound by beginnings or endings but live as long as love itself lives. And love, as Anne and Marcus had shown, never dies. And then, after countless cycles of birth and death, of universes blooming and folding into silence, there came a moment beyond moments when the echo of and Marcus stirred into awareness, as though love itself, weary of wandering in fragments, longed to gather itself whole again, and in that awakening, and felt as if she had stepped once more into an aisle, but this time the aisle stretched not through a church or a village but through eternity itself, a corridor of stars and collapsing suns, and Marcus was waiting, not as a man of one lifetime but as the eternal companion he had always been. The constant presence across every universe, every retelling, every myth. They looked upon each other and knew. They were no longer just remembered, no longer just symbols, but keepers of the flame that had guided creation from its first breath. And with that knowing came a new purpose, one not bound to earth or even to humanity, but to existence itself, for they realized that the story they once lived had become a covenant, and they were now its guardians. Where fear rose like a storm, they stood as calm. Where despair threatened to erase hope, they whispered dawn. Where civilizations trembled on the edge of ruin, their unseen hands steadied hearts toward courage. And though no eye could see them and no tongue could name them, all souls felt them, for Anne and Marcus had become more than lovers. They had become the eternal heartbeat of love itself, alive and awake, carrying the torch of resilience through the endless corridors of creation, forever watching, forever guiding, forever reminding that no night, however dark, can prevent the coming of dawn. And so Anne and Marcus, now awakened as guardians of love's eternal flame, began their quiet journey through the vastness of creation, not as rulers who demanded worship, nor as ghosts bound to memory, but as gentle presences woven into the fabric of existence, stepping in whenever the balance tilted too far toward despair. On distant worlds of sapphire deserts, they walked as wanderers, their faces unremarkable, yet their words carried the strange weight of dawn, and those who heard them found strength to rise again. On other worlds where beings sang instead of spoke, and became a voice within the harmony, Marcus a steady rhythm beneath the notes, guiding symphonies back toward hope. Sometimes they appeared as mentors to rulers who doubted their worth, sometimes as strangers who helped a farmer through the night, sometimes only as whispers within a child's dream. But always, they left behind courage, as if planting invisible seeds that would bloom when needed most. Civilizations who thought they were lost found direction again, not knowing why. Soldiers who wanted to surrender discovered resolve. Lovers separated by cruelty found paths back to each other. And all the while Anne and Marcus never claimed credit, never revealed their eternal nature, for their power was not in being seen but in being felt, like the first light of dawn that breaks not with thunder but with quiet certainty. And as eons passed, their journey became endless, a pilgrimage through worlds and lives, always new, always familiar, for wherever there were hearts, there was love, and wherever there was love, Anne and Marcus would be found, guardians not of thrones or crowns but of the only truth strong enough to endure all universes. That no darkness is final, no rejection is fatal, and love is the destiny that even eternity must bow to. But eternity, like every story, is never without conflict, and just as love had been carried across universes, so too had its shadow, born of every rejection, every betrayal, every fear left to fester in silence, gathering strength until it became a presence of its own, a vast darkness that moved not with malice but with emptiness, whispering that love was a lie, that dawn was an illusion, that all things ended in the cold silence of nothing. And one day, across a world of twin suns where beings of flame had begun to forget compassion, Anne and Marcus felt it stirring, a weight heavier than any sorrow they had known, a presence that sought not to destroy them but to unravel what they were. It came as a storm without wind, as a silence without peace, wrapping itself around and like the memory of rejection, around Marcus like the taste of betrayal, pressing into their souls with the cruel suggestion that their love had never mattered, that their story was but dust lost in the turning of worlds. For the first time since awakening into guardianship, Anne trembled. For the first time, Marcus doubted. The darkness grew stronger as they weakened, feeding on their cracks, drawing from the endless despair scattered across civilizations. But then, standing together as they always had, and reached for Marcus's hand, not in triumph, not in certainty, but in simple, stubborn faith, and whispered, "Even if the universe forgets, I remember. Even if everything fades, I choose you." And Marcus, with tears burning like stars, answered, "Then even in the end, we are not lost." At that moment, their bond blazed like a second dawn, a light not of suns but of souls, and the darkness recoiled, for though it fed on fear, it could not touch love freely chosen, again and again, across eternity. And so the storm broke, not in grand battle, but in the quiet strength of two souls who refused to let go, proving once more that love is not fragile memory but living fire, unquenchable even in the face of the void. And from that moment, when the darkness recoiled before their simple vow, something within creation shifted, as if the universe itself acknowledged their triumph. And in Marcus were no longer only guardians who walked unseen among mortals, whispering hope into hearts, but were entrusted with a deeper calling, woven into the balance of existence itself. Where once they had planted seeds of courage in individuals, now their touch could steady the tides of civilizations. Where once they had walked quietly through the alleys of sorrow, now they could guide the rhythm of worlds, tilting whole destinies back toward dawn when despair threatened to eclipse them. Yet even with this vastness of power, they remained unchanged at their core, and still reaching for Marcus's hand in silence, Marcus still watching her with the steady gaze that had first lifted her veil so long ago, because the secret of their strength was never in cosmic authority, but in love that remained tender, human, vulnerable. And as eons stretched into ages beyond counting, their presence became not just a myth or memory, but the living breath of balance itself. Light and shadow, hope and despair, dawn and night, all held steady because two souls refused to let go of each other. Civilizations who gazed into their sacred texts began to sense it. Some called them the eternal flame, others the twin pillars, still others the silent watchers. But all knew instinctively that whatever name they bore, and in Marcus were the reason the universe did not collapse into nothing, the reason the dawn always came after night. And quietly, humbly, the two lovers accepted this truth, not as rulers sitting upon a throne, but as companions still walking together, side by side, carrying forward the same vow they had spoken once in trembling voices, "You are my forever." And as the ages unfolded beyond count, new beings emerged from the fabric of existence itself, entities of light and thought, woven not from flesh but from the raw essence of creation, beings who could traverse galaxies with a breath and bend matter with a glance, yet who found themselves bewildered by the one truth they could not master, love. They understood the birth of stars, the death of worlds, the flow of time and the dance of energy, yet when they tried to hold another's presence close without fear, or to endure rejection without bitterness, or to wait through darkness for dawn, they faltered like children learning to walk. And so, in their searching, they found and in Marcus, not in thrones of fire or temples of light, but walking hand in hand through quiet places of the soul, speaking softly of things greater than power. These eternal beings, vast beyond measure, humbled themselves before two who had once been fragile mortals, asking to be taught the secret that had carried them through despair and shadow. And would smile, remembering her trembling steps down an aisle long gone, and Marcus would answer with a steadiness that had once lifted her veil, and together they would teach, not with sermons of thunder but with the living example of their bond, showing that love is not a force to be wielded but a promise to be chosen, again and again, across eternity. And these eternal students, though they could bend universes, wept like children at the simplicity of it, carrying the lesson into their own vast realms, spreading the truth that love is the only law that does not change, the only light that never fades. Thus Anne and Marcus became not just guardians, but teachers of the eternal, the first prophets of love to all existence, their story the root from which all wisdom blossomed, a reminder that even the smallest human choice can ripple into forever. But where there is teaching, there is always resistance, and among the eternal beings who gathered at the feet of Anne and Marcus, not all hearts bent toward their quiet wisdom. Some, vast and radiant in their brilliance, recoiled at the simplicity of love, mocking it as weakness, dismissing it as a fragile human illusion unfit for those who could command stars. "Why should we bow to a feeling?" they thundered, their voices shaking constellations. "We are the architects of reality itself. Why should we choose patience when we can take? Why endure rejection when we can rule?" And so from within the gathering arose a faction, beings of immense power who sought to prove that existence itself bowed not to love but to dominance, not to dawn but to shadow. They declared themselves the sovereigns of might, swearing to rewrite the law of the cosmos, to tear away the myth of and Marcus until nothing remained but the truth of power. And their rebellion spread like wildfire across galaxies, enticing whole civilizations with promises of control, of freedom from pain, of a destiny won by strength alone. For the first time in their eternal guardianship, and Marcus stood not against despair alone but against willful defiance, against a force that sought to erase the very flame they carried. Yet even then they did not raise weapons, for they knew love cannot be defended by violence. Instead, they stood together, hands intertwined, heart steady, speaking the same vow they had spoken at every turning of time, that love endures, that dawn comes, that fear cannot rule forever. And as the sovereigns of might rose higher, casting shadows across the stars, the stage was set for a struggle not of armies but of truth itself, a battle to decide whether creation would be built on power that consumes or love that sustains.